Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Daily Friends Show. I hope you all had a wonderful long weekend and a happy Easter to all of those who were celebrating. And today, for the first show of the week, I'm Nicholas Lorimer, your host, and I'm joined by Mr. Gabriel Krauser. Gabriel, how are you, sir?
Good, Nicholas. Feeling rested and ready to take on the news. How's it?
Excellent. And Mr. Herman Pretorius. Herman, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. I'm slightly intrigued by the fact that for the first, episode of this week, you are Nick Lorimer, and we'll see how that pans out. Perhaps you might be someone else tomorrow. I don't know. Perhaps you might be Mmusi Maimane if we're going to quote Tony Leon.
Right. Yes, we'll get onto that in a minute. But let's start with a story overseas, which I think is quite interesting for a number of reasons, and I'd like to get your guys' take on it. And that is a report that was published by the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, which was appointed by United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson after the Black Lives Matter protests. They published a 258-page report on inequality in Britain that looked into ethnic and racial disparities with regards to education, employment, the criminal justice system, and health. Boris Johnson described the report as an important piece of work, and it is now right that the government considers their recommendations in detail and assesses the implications for future government policy. One of the upshots of the report was that the report said that the UK is no longer a place where the system is deliberately rigged against ethnic minorities. The report did go on to say that while the UK should be regarded as a model for other white majority countries, it can't be considered a post-racial society because overt and outright racism persists in the UK, particularly online, the report found, adding that it remained a real force and should be taken seriously. But it also said that too often racism is a catch-all explanation and can simply be implicitly accepted rather than explicitly examined. The evidence shows, this is according to the report, that geography, family influence, socioeconomic background, culture, religion have a more significant impact on life chances than the existence of racism. The report was very heavily attacked by the opposition Labour Party. Labour dismissed it as a divisive polemic with cherry-picked statistics. Labour said, to downplay institutional racism in a pandemic where Black, Asian, and ethnic minority people who have died disproportionately and are now twice as likely to be unemployed is an insult, said the Shadow Women and Equality Secretary. Labour also said the government must urgently explain how they can publish content which they say glorifies the slave trade and immediately disassociate themselves from these remarks. They said that the report is more about politics than policy. One of the things the report argues for is that there should be some recommendations, for example, longer school days for schools that are in bad areas and have poor results, access to better quality career advice in schools for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, things like that. So, gentlemen, I know we all haven't had time to read the full report. But Gabriel, let me start with you. What are your thoughts on this, on the whole idea of publishing a report like this to begin with, and also perhaps what the report might say?
Yeah, so I think that the report should be credited on two fronts. First and foremost, there's many things to say about it. I haven't gotten all the way through. I will get all the way through by the end of the week. The first thing is the evidence-based approach. There's a tendency, and this tendency is as old as race itself, to close your eyes, reflect, and then divulge the fruits of your labor, as it were, by explaining to everyone what you saw when you gazed into your proverbial navel. And that is a very serious way of thinking about race, at least serious in the sense that people who are taken seriously often do it. And the alternative approach is to seek truth from facts. And this report really does that. It really delves into economic factors by income, by wealth, and by sector. When it looks at the criminal justice system, it's really getting into quite granular multivariable analysis. The same for the education system. So it's trying to figure out something which is quite difficult and which can be phrased like this. if the government is not in the business of trying deliberately to draft laws that discriminate against people by race, are there so many racists around that if you belong to one race or another, you can't expect a fair shake at getting a job, at finding a client, at purchasing from someone up the supply chain, of calling the police and getting a proper response, of getting a decent education, and so on. And that's a question that does require quite thorough statistical analysis, because of course not every racist that refuses to hire someone on the basis of how they look is going to wear that attitude on their sleeve. So you have to really do pervasive data analysis, and their findings are pretty damning to the thesis that people are being oppressed sort of by other voluntary actors, private actors. In the absence of laws, there's just so many racists that people can't get ahead. And in particular, they sort of break things down by various races and show that white per capita income is not the highest. There are various ethnicities or races that come out higher, but that's just one of the things. We'll get into more of those details once we finish reading the report. So the first thing is to seek truth from facts. I think it's very bold. One reason it's bold is if the facts had come out the other way, if the facts had come out saying, look, we can just show you statistically that your odds are half as much, controlling for education, controlling for work hours put in, controlling for other forms of socioeconomic background, you still have half as good an odd chance of becoming a mid-level accountant if you are, for example, Indian versus if you are white. That would be a damning result. That would humiliate all Brits. It would humiliate both the Tory government in charge as well as the Labour governments that have been in charge recently. And it would call for a serious upheaval. So when you set out to do an investigation like this, when you're not closing your eyes and sort of just propounding on what you hope to be the case, but you're actually seeking truth from facts, you always put yourself at hazard. And so good on them for taking that risk. And they came out with results that I think everyone should be delighted with. Everyone who is not a race merchant, whose career is tied to the project of saying that the whole world is racist, and the Brits more so than anyone else. That's the first thing, and I've taken very long to say it. So the second thing I'll say very briefly. The underlying philosophy is very much that the report's authors are explicitly targeting as the best outcome a world in which people don't judge each other on the basis of their race. And that is a stark difference to the philosophy of many mainstream race scholars who say, no, the outcome that we're seeking is for people to be judged by their race in perpetuity. We just want to shift those judgments. Instead of thinking of these people as less than and those as more than, we want to think of those as more than and these as less than, and sort of come up with maybe some horizontal, multicultural kind of analog where every race is special in its own way and it preserves that specialness. A sort of apartheid ideology, very much the rhetoric of apartheid, very much the rhetoric of W.E.B. Du Bois, Pan-Africanists 100 years ago. The equality of races is a very different philosophy to non-racialism. And non-racialism is the explicit target that this report is saying, look, we want to try and find evidence of where we are, and we want to try and send the UK in this direction. And those two things marry very well.
So I agree with that. That's precisely what I was thinking, is that it's great that this report brings this debate in a lot of ways, which is often, as you say, sort of filled with navel gazing, into the realm of sort of concrete things. So often is the debate on race relations fought with anecdote and kind of vague stereotypes and generalities and things like that. And by actually looking at things and producing some numbers, whether they're right or wrong, now there's something to argue with. There's something specific to talk about, discuss, debate, to examine. And I think that that's an incredibly healthy thing for this debate. And I presume that Labour or some other group will publish a counter report in the near future, which will claim that everything in this report is a lie. And then people will be able to examine the two arguments side by side and see which one is stronger. Herman, your thoughts, firstly, on the report, and secondly, whether this was a clever political move from Boris Johnson?
Yeah, so I mean, I echo everything Gabriel said and you said. it sort of reminds me about our essays and discussions that I've read and listened to and watched with Thomas Sowell surrounding his book, what's it, Discrimination, Disparities, or something like that. Book I haven't read yet, full disclosure. But it just, what I love about Sowell and what I like about this report is it sort of takes his methodology of, being a data historian, and looking back at the data and let the data speak for itself and then deliver things. Now, you cannot ever get away from your narrative and your agenda. I think we all have those intrinsic convictions that we can try to shield against, but they always filter through in our beliefs and our view of the world. But what in reading about this report, I was reminded of a little finding that Sowell made, that Chinese Americans, it's stupid to treat Chinese Americans as a single group, because within America, there are different, at least two main places in China where Chinese Americans come from. And if you take them as a group, you kind of get useless data, because if you look specifically, the one group of Chinese Americans coming from the one particular locale did much better socioeconomically than Chinese Americans who were racially the same, but from a different locale, a poorer and a less educated part of China. So already there you have this instance where you cannot just assume race is the thing. And that's what I'm so frustrated about the Labour's response to this, is they're saying, well, in this time of endemic institutional racism, how dare you say there's no such thing as institutional racism? It's like, yeah, but could you please give us the facts, the data on which you say that there's endemic racism? Could we please be rational about this enough to not go on anecdotal experience? It reminds me also of an incident where an Australian influencer or whatever person said it's so terrible for her because she knows Australia is such a racist country, but she's not experiencing that racism, and that's making her uncomfortable because the racists are hiding their racism so well. And that just cuts to the whole thing, that it must be there. There must be racism. There must be. You can't question it. It must be there. It's like air and oxygen and existence and electrons. It's there. The question is just, can you find it? And if you can find it, yay. If you can't find it, obviously you're a racist. So that's the first thing. I love the data-based approach, and that's why what makes Sowell such a remarkable data historian. And the second part is this actually was initiated by Theresa May. So politically, it's convenient for Boris Johnson that it comes to fruition during his time. But the race report and the investigations and the racial disparities report initiative really comes from the Theresa May era. But I think there's a very interesting difference. Had this report been published under May, I think you would have gotten a more left-leaning identitarian interpretation, where I trust Boris Johnson's government a bit more. They have people like James Cleverly, Kemi Badenoch, minority MPs, but real clear thinkers on evidence-based race relations. So I must say, it's politically, it's quite a brave move, and globally, it is something to be welcomed. Really, it is something to be welcomed. Something I did not expect from a country that is currently in the throes of statute down tearing and all the toxic little outshoots of Black Lives Matter.
Right, and this, it's not only in the UK that you're seeing data like this come out. The American magazine Commentary recently published an article called "The Good News They Won't Tell You About Race in America" by a political scientist called Wilfred C. Riley. And he went into various statistical breakdowns of how wealth and education and all these things are shaping up in America. And he found that there's been very significant progress on, creating equality between races. He said that 7 of the wealthiest 8 ethnic groups in the United States today are populations of color. One of the most educated groups in the United States are Nigerian Americans. So it shows that when you kind of delve into the specifics, these questions often get a lot more complicated, and they bring you to other problems which are not addressed by the race merchants, things like education, things like poor government policy, stuff like that. Gabriel?
Briefly jump in there. Something That's very interesting. If you read Walter Williams on apartheid in South Africa, if you can think of a country that must have been institutionally as racist as they come in the last 50 years, it would probably last 60 years or so. It would probably have been South Africa in the 60s and 70s. What Williams, who happened to be a black economist himself, found was that the state had to keep on constricting the law, making it more restrictive, because white South Africans were doing business or employing with black people who the government did not want to. So if there's one country you would have found institutional racism writ large, it would have been South Africa in the 70s and 60s. And even there, the ordinary citizen sought the loophole to interact with people of a different color. So, I mean, it's just really, if you're going to think race is the factor, I think you are bringing your narrative to a conversation about data, and I don't think you're going to look like a prince.
Right. So just to conclude this, Gabriel, your thoughts on the criticism of the report and anything else you want to add?
Yeah, so one of my views, which is not very popular anywhere, is that one should take seriously the thought that there are two definitions of racist, and that one definition of racist is you are a racist just in case you emphasize individual humans or group projects that are not defined by race, for example, religion. That you're a racist if this is what you're on about. And you're a racist if you make any argument that, for example, undermines affirmative action. So I was recently going over Kwame Appiah's book about The Lies That Bind, his section on race. He tries to give some examples. Sorry, it was his biography of W. Du Bois, Lines of Descent. He tries to give an example of what racial codes of conduct are, the kinds of expectations where superficial ones are like, oh, white people are supposed to be good at long distance. No, what are white people good at? I don't know, being nasty. And black people are supposed to be very good at dancing or something. It's like, okay, these are a bit superficial. The more serious one is like, black people are expected to support affirmative action and are shamed for not supporting affirmative action. And if they do not support affirmative action, they are somehow betraying their race. Now, that idea has its proponents, right? And they will say any black person that doesn't support affirmative action is a race traitor, and any white person that doesn't support affirmative action is a racist. Now, that is clearly a use of the term that's in play. And I think under that usage, it's perfectly legitimate to say that this report is racist. That's what it is. It's emphasizing individuals. It's looking at the data and finding that individuals tend to emphasize either one another's meritocratic capacities or group projects, family building, religion, cultural endeavors, and so on. Its call to action is non-racial as opposed to multiracial. And so in that sense, with the one exception that it says it should be an example, the UK should be an example to white majority countries, which is a bit racialist itself. So they're buying the logic. I think that's terrible myself. But other than that, they don't buy into the logic that black people should be inspirations to black people and white people should be inspirations to white people. And so they're racist. Now, that's one definition of racist. And there's another one, which I think no South African needs an education about, where you hurt someone in a material and concrete way because of how they look, based on your idea of what that means about their heritage. So I do think there's a semantic thing going on here where one word racist is being used in two different ways. And, give it to the left. They are internally coherent in describing this kind of report as racist. It does undermine their project. It doesn't suit their ends. It makes it much harder for them to maintain a credibility in their style of thinking. And I think that debate about what racism is and what a race is one that is not over in the UK. I think people just have two very different ideas about it. And as you said, Nick, the thing that this report can do is if Labour then comes up with its counter report is make its terms explicit and give people conceptual room to talk about this very important issue, armed with facts. And my suspicion is that in so doing, one version of racism, of what racism is, will triumph, and that is exactly the version which will make it possible to get rid of more racists. And that's the sort of old-fashioned idea that racism is harming someone else because of how they look, and that this newfangled idea that racism is failing to judge someone by how they look will go under the bridge in time, to be forgotten, much like phlogiston and other esoteric. Phlogiston was a 19th century idea about the material that fire is made of, and people said this is what fire is, and then there was a very serious debate between scientists about what fire is. And they said no, fire has a negative weight, and it's made out of phlogiston, and you could put it in a cup.
Honorable chair. Could
and then they said eventually people just gave up. They said this is a silly idea.
I agree with Herman. Let's not get stuck too much in the weeds of esoteric philosophy. And let's move on.
Look, no one likes the idea, but one reason this matters is because of the topic that we're about to segue into. You must expect, when seeking truth from facts and when aiming for non-racialism, to be called a racist. You oughtn't to be proud of it. You should try to help that person to realize that their assumption about what a racist is grounded in a very distorted view of the world.
A silly idea, yeah. I agree. There's definitely merit in examining what exactly people mean by these terms, because otherwise we just end up talking past each other all the time. Speaking of people talking past each other, let us move on to this next topic, which we don't have that much time to cover, but we will do our best. And that is, there has been a little bit of mostly social media driven, but some media driven outrage at something that former DA leader Tony Leon said about former DA leader Mmusi Maimane. In an interview with Media 24, Tony Leon was quoted as saying that Maimane was an experiment that went wrong when he was elected DA leader in 2015. Mmusi responded to this on Twitter, saying that he was upset that he had been called an experiment. And he went on to say in Setswana, and I'll read the translation, "You exposed yourself and are even disrespectful. Actually, you've disrespected me badly," he said to Tony Leon. Tony then clarified, and when journalists asked him what he meant by experiment, to say that it was an experiment to elect to leadership of the DA someone who had never voted for the party before joining it, or at least never voted for the party before he basically became leader of it, a senior leader in it. Immediately, there was a follow-up where I saw IOL published a report that was entitled "Black Leaders Demand Answers from Tony Leon," and it had quotes from several people, Bongani Madikizela from the Western Cape, the ex-leader of KZN, Zwakele, as well as someone who wasn't a black leader from the DA, Mike Moriarty, demanding that Leon explain himself and what he means here. So, Herman, what do you make of the story? What do you make of the fuss? What do you make of Tony Leon's comments?
I think it's very much on topic on the previous discussion. Sorry, there are some bloody hardy-dust just being offensive. I think what frustrates me most about, oh, for Pete's sakes, what frustrates me most about this whole thing is that immediately it's about race. It could have been a question of experience. He was inexperienced. He was younger than your average political leader. It's an experiment, a failed experiment, to elect a young leader because you want to chime demographically. That's one way of cutting this cake. Another one is this political ideology. He wasn't, seeped in the DA's values and in the DA's way. Another way is you could look at it as a non-Jewish man. Because Tony Leon was a leader of the DA, and then there was a woman, Helen Zille, was the leader of the DA, and then there was the first non-Jewish guy of the leader of the party. He was. So you can slice this cake of identity in so many countless ways. I mean, you can make it the father of two, or early married, or devout Christian. I mean, or Setswana speaker. There are so many ways to cut the identitarian cake that I just get so annoyed when people immediately jump to race. It really is a betrayal of a shallowness of understanding of what liberalism really means. Liberalism is to say that the individual is not some outflow of a group identity, but they are an individual. The liberal thing would have been to go, Tony Leon criticized Maimane as a failed experiment. Could it have been his inexperience? Could it have been his youth? Could it have been his background as a preacher, as a practicing, as a charismatic or Pentecostal Christian? These people who jump to this is a race issue betray an underlying racism by saying that Maimane could only be defined as an individual distinct from other leaders by his skin color. And I think Verwoerd would be immensely proud that his legacy has outlived his policy. Because if you look through history, it's really a question of what's the point of differentiation. And if you find the point of differentiation between you and another person, and you use that maliciously, that's where sexism, racialism, racism, and religious intolerance, all those things come from. But the idea that that you only consist of one identity marker is, I think, such a problem. And that's why the individual is so important. That's why I don't like ethno-collectivism, because I'm rambling on now, but I'll conclude this. I am a white man, Christian, Afrikaner, South African, classical liberal. I like pasta, slightly overweight, and I love watching tennis. Okay, so we have 9 points of my identity there. To which group do I belong? Which is my group? Why do other people have the right to say, no, Herman, your group is the white people? But that's only one marker of my identity. No. You don't get to decide which group you belong to, because we have determined this is the criterion of group formation. And I think that's the rubbish at the heart here, is how can you look at a statement like that and just assume racism? If you do, I think you're a racist. Sorry, that was very rambly.
Yes, to that I say, pasta eaters of the world unite. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Gabriel, in 60 seconds, because we don't have a lot of time, what are your thoughts on this issue and this debate?
Yeah, no, I think Herman's done well. Let's recall that the great architects of the idea of a parliament described after the 1689 glorious revolution, parliament is that crucible in which we will experiment which ideas shall reign and which shall fall. Politics is all an experiment, and the experimentors are you and I. And Mmusi failed that experiment. He didn't raise the votes that had been promised. I will add, there is a very important thing to note, which is individuality. And Mmusi Maimane identifies as a proud black person. Now, I struggle to find any reason to be proud of my race or my membership of that race. And I think that people who are proud not to be proud of their race are onto something. Mmusi does identify.
It's different from culture. You're not saying culture.
No. But Mmusi is very proud to be black, and that's how he sees himself. And so whenever he's criticized, he sees himself as being a representative of a group of people, I don't know, population 800 million or 1 billion, whose esteem is on the line. And, Tony Leon with his little needle might prick the sense of self-worth that every black person in the universe might have. And Mmusi is obviously very worried about that. And that makes me very worried about him, because I think most black people are going to be just fine without him, and they really don't care. and shame. Yeah.
And it's summed up, I think, with the quote that led some of the news reporting on this, was Mmusi saying, "I'm a human being, not your science study," which is some fantastic.
He's very vulnerable. He's a very vulnerable person. His feelings,
as though his humanity was truly being called into question by Tony here.
Are like,
So we had another topic today, which was Zuma rethinking the constitution because it subverts the will of the people. And I think we'll have to return to that probably tomorrow. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us today. We will be back tomorrow. I will probably still be your host, Nicholas Lorimer. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Cheers, everyone.